Good evening, everyone. Bienvenue to the AF USA book discussion of the 2022 One Book, One Federation selection, Nos Richesses. My name is Renee Ketchum, as you know by now, and I'm in charge of the cultural offerings for AF USA. And we're thrilled to be talking about our last chance to read this book tonight. AF USA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French to learn French, live French, and love French at the Alliance Française. So we have some wonderful events coming up. If you enjoy the lecture tonight with Binita, we have the author, Kaouther Adimi, coming tomorrow night to speak with Hamza, our national coordinator, and Barbara Bouguignon of the Cultural Center in Boston. So that's at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And then we have our continuation of Chef Alain Lenotre, and then Alexandra Capanzano, who's doing a wonderful cookbook event, and then Paris, a city of ideas. So stay tuned to what we're doing. We have lots of wonderful things coming up. So say the logistics, please stay on mute during the presentation, stay on speaker view, and all questions should be placed in the chat for the Q&A following Binita Mehta's presentation. If you have any technical issues, sign in, sign out, sign back in. It's pretty easy. And so that everyone knows, this event is being recorded for our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, please do. And the total runtime will be 1 hour. So I'm really, really honored to welcome Binita Mehta. She was a professor of French at, I'm losing my notes here. Excuse me. Binita Mehta, who is a professor of French and director of the first-year program at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York, where she teaches courses in French language, literature, and culture. In addition to courses in French and French courses in English translation, Binita teaches in the International Studies program, the first-year program, and the honors program. So really welcome, Binita. We are so excited about our last chance to study this book with you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen now. Is that good? All right. So hello, everybody. I just wanted to add, since we talked about the Alliance Française, I was telling Melissa earlier that I actually studied French at the Alliance Française in India. That's where I really learned my French. And I went through all of the classes and got my diplôme de langue and diplôme supérieur at the Alliance Française in Bombay. And my French teachers, a lot of them came from France, because they were actually, a lot of them were doing their military service. Instead of doing their military service, they came to teach French in India. And that's a lot of the teachers in India actually did that. So I owe a lot to the Alliance Française in terms of my acquisition of my French skills. Anyway, I don't know how many of you have actually read the book, but I just thought I'd spend 2 minutes in the beginning. And I was going to kind of go through the book. Of course, we don't have time to discuss everything in the book, but I thought I'd discuss it in 3 ways, 3 points: characters, themes, and structure. So I don't know if anybody has actually, if you've read the book or you remember the book, what you see as the main characters of the book. And is that okay for people to talk? I'm not sure. I know you were asked to be on mute, but
yes, people can unmute themselves.
All right, unmute themselves. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of see if anybody wanted to share some of what they had read. And if not, I can go through my own points and then we can talk some more later. But I just thought I'd pause here for a minute. Okay, so
Renee, do you have a comment?
Oh, Renee, yes.
So I think I've loved the book, and I've read it both in French and in English, right. But I think that the principal characters, there are many characters, which make the book a little bit complicated, but the French characters are Edmond Charlot, Riyad, and then the incredible character of Abdallah, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Right. Okay, so that sounds good. Those are the 3 main characters, but each one has a different style, and the author has a different way of presenting each character, which actually makes it very interesting. So I'm going to go through my points that I had created. So the next slide tells you a little bit about Charlot, who was actually Albert Camus' first editor and editor of other contemporary French writers. And through his journal, we hear the works. I'm trying to see if I can minimize I'm going to minimize the video. Through the journal, we hear about works by other contemporary Algerian and French writers such as Jean Amrouche, Emmanuel Robles, Mohamed Dib, and Mouloud Firaoun, among others. How do I get to the next? Hang on. not letting me move on. Hang on, maybe I just need to use that. Okay, got it. In 1936, he opens a bookstore in Algiers called Les Richesses on the Rue Charras. He moves to Paris in 1945 after the occupation and opens the Edition Charlot that closes in 1949 after competition from the publisher Gallimard. He frequents, while in Paris, he frequents authors such as Gertrude Stein and André Gide, as well as the Café de Flore, which we all know is the regular meeting place of authors like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. As Renee mentioned, Riyad, who is another character, an important character. So we learn about Charlot mainly through his journal. And the way it's set up in the book, you can kind of tell the difference between the journal because it has different dates in it. And you have a little, he writes at, during that period from, I get to that a little later. But Riyad is the young man who arrives, who's another character in the novel, who's a young man who arrives in Algiers in 2017 to clean out the bookstore and to replace it with a donut store. He's not a reader of literature. I see that I have some typos there. Not a reader of literature or lover of literature. And so there's a quote in the book which says, Louis qui n'a jamais aimé lire ne trouve aucun charme à tout ce papier imprimé, relié, collé. He who has never liked to read finds no charm in all this printed, bound, and glued paper. So even though the book is about, the novel is about the love of literature and the love of reading, you have this young man who comes to Paris and his job is to actually get rid of the bookstore and kind of clean it out so they can replace it with something else. And of course, the third character is actually I added a fourth character in the novel, Abdallah, who's an old man who had worked in Les Richesses with Charlot and remembers it with nostalgia. He shares memory of that bookstore now in disrepair with Riyad. And he provides this bridge between the past and the present. So he's this older character who still lives in the neighborhood and meets Riyad when he comes. And then it's while Riyad is cleaning out his bookstore, the bookstore, that he finds Edmond Charlot's journal and starts reading it. I think there's a fourth character in the novel, which is the city of Algiers, right? Especially the area around the Rue Amini, which is known as the Lex Rue Charras. So the old name of the road was Charras. That was when Les Richesses was opened. But then I guess it was changed after independence. They changed the name to Hamini. And the old quarter of Algiers, the Kasbah, which is described as a trou noir or a black hole by the taxi driver who drives Riyadh from the airport. And while he was describing the Kasbah as this black hole, the Kasbah is this old area of Algiers, which is on a hill, and it's the oldest part, and it overlooks the ocean. So you can go, as you go down the hill, you can, as you go to the top of the hill, you can actually see the ocean. And there's a cinematic reference that this came to me as I read the book. In 1937, there was a film called Pépé le Moko by Julien Duvivier, who was starring Jean Gabin, also describes the Kasbah as a refuge for criminals, murderers, and foreigners and prostitutes. So it's a very interesting film with Jean Gabin, who plays a jewel thief who leaves Paris and hides out in the Kasbah. And because the Kasbah is this crowded place, the police are having a hard time finding him. And Jean Gabin has his friends who help him hide within the Kasbah in Algiers. There was a remake, I think, also of the film made by Hollywood with Charles Boyer playing the main role of Pépé le Moko. So it's a very interesting film. If you've never seen it, I would recommend it. The next slide, I decided to show you some images of some of the personalities that are mentioned in some of the writers that Edmond Charlot actually met and frequented, right? So you have Mohammed Dib was one of them, Mouloud Feraoun, who wrote Le Fils du Pauvre, one of the very early novels by an Algerian author. You have Emmanuel Robles. There's Charlot. There's a picture of Charlot right here. And Camus, he was the first editor of Albert Camus, who we all know, the Camus of The Stranger fame, and Jean Amrouche. So these are just some images of the people who are mentioned in the novel. I just thought it would be nice to see some of the faces. And since I mentioned Pépé le Moko, you have a still here from Pépé le Moko with Jean Gabin sitting, and that was what I was talking about. It's on a hill, and it's a very crowded area on a hill, and then you can see the ocean right from, and it's a great place to hide if you're a criminal, because it's very hard for people to find you. And this was also the Kasbah was also an important area during the the Battle of Algiers, that it was used as an important, is very much part of the Algerian War of Independence, which there was a Battle of Algiers that took place, and the Kasbah is an important region in that. And here's another view. It shows you how the housing, it's kind of very clean knit houses with narrow streets, and it's a very interesting neighborhood in Algiers. I wanted to talk a little bit about the themes. Of course, the most important theme is literature, right? The book is about books and about reading and about the love for literature. And so literature, which becomes a kind of a means to overcome obstacles, but at the same time to preserve history and culture. And there is a scene, because Riyadh is there to kind of get rid of that bookstore, the old bookstore, to clean it up for another store where they would be selling beignets or donuts. I guess that would be the closest to donuts. There's a scene where Abdullah says, you're here just to destroy. You're not really, books up there. I mean, books are such an important piece of one's history and culture that by removing it, you're actually deleting or erasing one's history and culture. So literature, of course, being a very important theme. You have an editor who is one of the main characters, who's surrounded by authors, etc. Another important theme I see is which is throughout the novel, is the French colonization of Algeria. And within the novel, you see different important dates that the author kind of, mentions about important dates which led to the Algerian War of Independence. So she first mentions the future leaders of the Algerian War who had fought. There is a scene in there's a section in the novel where you had many of the Algerians, many of them the future leaders of the War of Independence, who fought for France during World War II and are decorated by Charles de Gaulle. And I won't read the quote, but this is right after the war. And one of them, he decorates a lot of these who then become future heroes of the revolution. In Sétif, which is a city in Algeria, in 1945, the Algerians who wanted to celebrate their victory in World War II are massacred by the French soldiers, right? So, and this quote is interesting. Nous soulevons des banderoles où nous réclamons l'égalité avec les Français, la libération de nos prisonniers politiques et l'indépendance de l'Algérie. So we raise our banners and demand equality with the French, the freedom of our political prisoners and Algerian independence. And instead of that, they're actually massacred. So there's a massacre that takes place in 1945, just after the Algerians are actually decorated for helping France in World War II. So that's an important scene that we see, an important section in the book. The other important date is 1964, where it's almost cinematic, the novel in a way, because I'm speaking about it in scenes, but this is a chapter in the novel, where in 1954, 6 men, Krim Balkasem, Larbi Ben Mahidi, Mohammad Budaif, Rabah Bitat, Mustafa Ben Bulaid, Didouche Murad, they meet in the Bab el Oud area of Algiers, which is another important area in Algiers, to announce that October 31st and early November 1st would be the beginning of the insurrection or the War of Independence. Earlier that same year, the French army had just been defeated by Ho Chi Minh's army in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. So this was an important date because this is the beginning of the War of Independence, the Algerian War of Independence, which took 8 years. They didn't get independence till 1962. But this is an important date that she mentions, and the meeting of these 6 men who were the leaders. In Algiers in 1959, in his journal, Charlot also notes the torture, and then a little into the war, right? So the war starts in 1954, doesn't end till 62. So in 59, in his journal, Charlot notes the torture and killing of members of the FLN, which is the National Liberation Front, which are the Algerian freedom fighters, by the OAS, or the secret armed organization of the French army. And we learn about the pressure on the French from the world, including the United Nations, to stop the brutality of the Algerian War. So that's another date that's mentioned in her book. And then finally, on October 7th, 1961, she also mentions this important episode in Paris, where Algerians in Paris protesting the Algerian War are thrown into the Seine by Maurice Papon of the occupation. He was the police chief during the occupation under the Vichy regime. They're thrown into the Seine. And this is this episode has been recently talked about quite a lot. It was buried for a long time. the killing of these Algerians by the French police, but it has been talked about in recent years. Another cinematic reference that comes to mind is the film The Battle of Algiers, which many of you may have seen, 1966, a film by Gillo Pontecorvo, which was he's an Italian filmmaker, and the film was made, and really it was Algiers in the 60s, right to the war, right after Algerian independence, and it's shot documentary style, and it shows how different factions of the Algerians fought the war. You have women who are carrying bombs under their veils, under their hijabs, and putting them down in cafes. And so it's a recreation of the war, but it's very closely resembles what actually happened. That film has also been was shown actually by George W. Bush in the White House to kind of look at the way the French countered some of the tactics of the Algerian independence, Algerian liberation, people who were part of the National Liberation Front. So that's another important film. If you haven't, the film was actually banned in France for many years because it was so true to life, and it showed the brutality of the war on both sides. So that was another important cinematic reference that came to mind. And I just wanted to again bring in some of the images of people who she mentions. These are some of the leaders of the Algerian Liberation Front, the FLN, the front, I forget, FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, National Liberation Front, and you have the various people who I mentioned earlier. And Ben Bella, who was the first president of Algeria, he was the one who was decorated by de Gaulle after World War II for helping them win the war. And I just have also a little, just the DVD cover of the Battle of Algiers, which is the film that I just mentioned. So I just thought I'd put these images in. Another important theme throughout the book, I keep talking about it as a film, it is cinematic, but the novel, memories and voices, right? And so you have the first person singular, the eye of the Charlot, because Charlot, who's writing in the first person singular when he writes his journal, and Riyad is also the first person singular. Then you have the first person plural of the us, right? So what makes the novel complicated is that you have she changes the voices, right? So there are multiple voices that speak. So the us of the Algerian memory of the street Hamani, which is the old name, which is the new name of the old Rue Charras. The us of the Algerians, so there's also the nous of the Algerians who narrate community memory or memories of life under French colonial rule and during the war. So there you have multiple voices, right? It's very postmodern in that sense. You have multiple voices who are speaking. There's not one voice. And then you have the one, or the on, which represents the authority figure, the colonial presence, and the collective, and then you have the collective you that appeals to the community of readers. So sometimes that can be disconcerting because you move from the moi, from the je to the nous, to the on, to the nous, to the vous, right? So those are also just to show that the novel it's not spoken with one voice, but you hear multiple voices. So this is part of the structure. There's some overlap with what I said earlier. So multiple heterogeneous voices. It's a non-linear narrative that reaches time and space, right? So you have Charlot, who's writing from 1955 to 1961, who tells his story in the form of a journal, a first-person narrative. At the age of 21, he becomes the proprietor of the bookstore called Les Richesses. And one of the lines that is quoted related to him is l'homme qui lit en vaut deux, a man who reads is worth two, right? So for him, reading is really an important part of what is a way to preserve one's history and culture. Then you have Riyad, the young Algerian who arrives in Algiers in 2017 to empty the Les Richesses and to open a donut store. Then you have the omniscient narrator who also uses the pronoun us, or and nous to represent the voice of the Algerians. One of the lines in the novel that I picked up, nous sommes les habitants de cette ville et notre mémoire est la somme de nos histoires. So we are the inhabitants of the city and our memory is the sum of our histories. And I said history stories because the word histoire in French has both meanings, right? So it has the meaning of history and has the meaning of story. And, these are just some of my final thoughts. And I'm sure that you may have other thoughts that you want to share, but I wanted to, I looked at the title of the novel, which is Nos Richesses, right? We have Nos Richesses. I don't know whether you can't see the book. Our Riches with the name of the bookstore, the library in the novel, Les Vraies Richesses, right? So possible answers, the bookstore library is a mythical space or place that is a treasure trove of riches of past memories. And Nos Richesses, the title of the novel, symbolizes our collective history and culture. So this notion of our riches are part of it's our collective history and culture, right? So it's interesting that she calls the bookstore, which was named by Charlot, Les Vraies Richesses, and becomes our riches. So this is part of our history. Even Algerian history is part of our history, right? The French in Algeria. All right, so I just closed it. I just open it up for thoughts and questions. I'm going to stop sharing, and I would like to open it up for questions or comments or anything, any clarifications that you may have, or anything you didn't understand if I went through things very quickly.
I have a problem with my video, but my audio unfortunately works. I have a question about the symbolism of closing the bookstore and opening a donut store, which is, I mean, bookstore symbolizes, something that nourishes your mind, and donut store, something that satisfies physical, nourishment, but not of a necessary kind. It's like sweets, things that are not essential. Do you find anything there, sort of?
I mean, I looked the way that's a good point. The enriching there's the body and the soul, but I thought of it more as a commercial enterprise, that they were removing something that was literary and historical, that was part of the history of not only the French culture, but also French Algerian culture, because there were a lot of Algerian authors who were also published and sold in that book. And to kind of then diminish it, to me, it was more a diminishing of, by opening a donut store, we don't even care. We're just going to open something that's a commercial venture. Yes, but yes, donuts, actually, but it is a sweet, right? It's a dessert. So is that nourishment? I don't know, but it's a good point. That's a good analogy. Nourishment of body and soul. But I saw it more as a commercial enterprise, and that they were losing this important part of history. And I think Abdullah, who is the character who bridges the past and present, he's still alive, and he's wandering around this neighborhood, and he's really regretting and nostalgic for the past because he had worked there. And after it had become a bookstore, it became a lending library. So it had become a library. So they were lending these books out to the people. So between a lending library where you're actually educating people and selling donuts, interesting. That's how I saw it. That's how I read it. But I think you make a good point, though.
Well, thank you.
Binita, I had a question. It's Renee, or a question, an observation. I was very interested in the fact that the name of the bookstore was based on a writer that I don't know, unfortunately, Jean Giono. I mean, there was a very specific reason that the bookstore was named Les Vraies Richesses, because it was based on this book by Giono, in which he basically, I gather from the text that basically that this you need to return to the true riches, which are not only literature, but that are bigger than that are land, that are spiritual, that are so I just thought that, just as a comment, that his choice of the name of the bookstore was very, very important to the text.
Right. That's a good point. And Giono was, he was influenced by Giono, right? But I like the way that her title of the novel also kind of changes the pronoun, right? Les Vraies Richesses to Nos Richesses, which is interesting too. Yeah.
Which is hopeful, because
right.
We want in other words, Les Richesses makes it somewhat Nos Richesses makes it more subjective, that these are things that we should value.
Correct.
And I was really interested by the character of Abdallah. I mean, obviously, there's got to be some symbolism there. I mean, he wears his, entre guillemets, it's his white sheet, but it's a shroud, and he's the guardian of the history of the So again, you've got that whole spiritual element that
Right.
is very clear throughout the book.
There's an interesting line where he says, where Abdullah is having this conversation with Riyadh, right? And I think this is quoted actually this is the line that was quoted in the actual, the study guide that they had given us, where he says, que fait quelqu'un qui préfère les maladies aux livres d'une librairie? Je dois la vider et la... Pourquoi? Riyadh says, c'est mon travail. And Abdullah said, détruire une librairie, c'est un travail, ça? C'est un stage. Because he's not only there, he's also there as an intern, right? He comes there because he's an intern. C'est un stage. Tu veux devenir destructeur de la librairie, c'est un métier? Non, ingénieur. Les ingénieurs construisent, ils ne détruisent pas. So this notion about that he is there as an intern trying to, get rid of this library, this bookstore. And he says, and he's saying, les ingénieurs construisent ne détruisent pas. So I think that was an interesting exchange with him. There are also other characters in the novel that I didn't mention, the characters who live in the neighborhood of the librairie, of the bookstore. There's a pizza guy and he eats his meals there with them. He gets to know the people in the neighborhood. So Riyadh, even though he goes there with this sense of, as someone who doesn't like to read, right? At some point in the novel, he says, I'm not a reader, right? So you have Riyadh, who's the younger generation, who's not a reader, who goes there and, but suddenly does somehow find a connection, right? He finds a connection to the bookstore. He gets involved in the journal and finds a connection to Algeria and to the bookstore, right? And gets to know the people in the neighborhood. And then in fact, he eats, I think at one point, somebody prepares a couscous for him and all kinds of things. So he somehow, even though he goes there on an internship, he does change. There is a slight, you see him changing and being transformed a little bit by what he encounters there and what he sees there and the people that he meets there, which I thought was also very nicely done. Yes, go ahead. Claire, you're on mute.
Merci. I regret that I was in book club with this book about 4 months ago. I did go to 2 different book clubs and I love both clubs that I went to, but it's been such a long time. But lucky for me, I'm now reading everything on Kindle. And that you can like highlight stuff and recap. So that my memory's not good on the book. But you mentioned something about Riyadh saying he didn't like to read. Well, I found it very interesting that Edmond Charlot, he also basically, he was more into the production of the books themselves, the print, the covers, and not the literature itself. And I was blown away by the authors that he had published. The one that comes, when I go to France, I hang out in Montpellier, and they actually have a tram stop named after Garcia Lorca, the Spaniard.
Right.
And he published his poetry. So he really was quite the intellectual of his day. But I agree with you, that transformation of Riyadh becoming appreciating that. And I don't want to ramble on too much and dominate, but ramble
on.
Okay, well, the one thing I wish I understood more, because my understanding of this whole Algerian situation, it's coming to me, my education in drips and drabs. In Montpellier, about 5 years ago, I actually was there, and it was sometime March or April, and it was the anniversary of the end of the Algerian War. And they had this huge memorial to it. And it looked like these soldiers from the French Foreign Legion marched out, and these old veterans from the war marched out. And I think the Algerians, a lot of them went to the south of France there. But I still don't understand the sides in that conflict. But I did understand that the Algerians were more or less betrayed by the French when they helped them during World War II. And then here, their backs are turned on them. So I really feel for those people. And I made a note in my book, because right at the time I was reading it, Macron had just made a visit over to Algeria. And at that point, the Ukrainian war had just broke out. And I think he was going over there to try to secure some fuel. some gas and oil from them, and patch it
Mm.
up. And he then made a big apology, and that was just this year, to the Algerians for what had happened. And one more thing, if my French history, I wish I was a little bit younger and I could benefit from an education, but I go on YouTube, and there's this one professor who maybe 15 years ago, he recorded in English Yale courses, 2 different series about French history. And one of the series, it ended with one of the last one was the Algeria and Vietnam War. And both of them, 54 at that time, the undoing of the colonial empire. And he was very critical of de Gaulle. And one more thing for anybody who happens to get that TV series, MHZ, I watched it a couple years ago, and I'm always looking for something good. And I don't remember all these shows I see, but there's one that's on MHZ channel. It doesn't pop up automatically like Tandem and the more recent ones, but it's called Speakerine. And it takes place in 1962. And I'm just watching it again because one of the subplots of that, it's like 6 episodes, maybe 8 episodes. 1962 is the Algerians in Paris at that time, and the scenery, the way, so anyway, I'm just learning all about this war. And I tried to watch the Battle of Algiers. I rented it from my library, and it was just too slow. And it was 3 or 4 hours long, and I just couldn't stick with it. So someday I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna watch that movie.
I'm just going to make one comment to all what you said, but the sides in the war there were the Arquis, who were the HARKI, who were the Algerian soldiers who fought with the French, right?
Right.
And they were actually should have been compensated, but never got that compensation. And they were actually considered betrayed. They were considered traitors by the Algerians. So they were in this no man's land. So I think that made things very complicated. And the Arquis are still waiting to be compensated. And they moved to France after they got independence, but they're still waiting to be compensated. So the Algerian war in some ways is not over yet. The French are still dealing with parts of the war. Then, of course, you had the Pieds Noirs, who were the settlers, right? Who were the colonial settlers of France, who were also moved to France. So you have these 2 groups. One is the Algerians who fought with the French, who collaborated, but not collaborated, but who worked for the French government in Algeria. And the Pieds Noirs, who were the colonial, like Albert Camus himself was a Pieds Noir, right? He was born in Algeria. So you have these 2 groups, and there's a lot of tension. Even the Pieds Noirs are considered in France, they're not treated very well because they were the old colonial rulers of France. So it's a very complicated history. Well, and I think in many ways they're still dealing with that history. Well, it's not over yet.
You think they would have tried to treat their citizens a little bit better. The French had their own class completely separate and over and above. True. And that I don't understand why, anyway, why anybody would put up with that, but I guess money talks, huh?
Well, colonization anywhere causes a lot of, has been, was horrible for a lot of the people under colonial rule. And the Pieds Noirs were caught in between, and the Arquis were caught in between because they were, because they worked for the French in Algeria. So it's a complicated situation.
Like running the government.
Fonctionnaire, right. And then, of course, you had all the Algerians who fought with the French in the war, who were also considered World War II, right? Who were then decorated by de Gaulle. Some of the leaders who then became leaders of the independence, the War of Independence. So. So it's interesting. And then, of course, Algeria has been through all kinds of other issues. In the 90s, they had the war between the Islamists and the military. And so it's been through there's been a lot of turmoil in Algeria.
Too bad. Right. Do they still speak French there primarily, or are they speaking another form of French? To the population? Do they have their own language, an Algerian language there? Or?
Well, they speak Arabic, and I think they speak French. Okay. Most educated Algerians will speak French and Arabic. Okay. And then you have the Berbers who have their own culture and language. So the Berbers are a separate community of people. Right. So it's got a very diverse population. I'm sure there was a Jewish population in Algeria too, which was also quite well-known. There's a book, the Le Chat de Rabbin. I don't know whether you've ever seen the comic book by, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but it's called The Rabbi's Cat, which is about the Jewish, it's about the Jewish community in Algiers, actually.
Oh, okay.
It's very interesting. It's a series of graphic novels by, and the name escapes me, but if you look up Rabbi's Cat, you might hear it. I think Margie had her hand up. Sorry, go ahead.
I do. Thank you. I was surprised as I was reading this, and I have about 5 pages left to go in French, at how, even though I knew how violent and horrible this war was and how terribly the French treated the Algerians, I was surprised that the author was able to make me feel almost nostalgic for a certain period of culture. And I haven't read any Giono. I have read some Camus, but not on this topic. And I was just wondering if you could tell us anything about their ideas of the loss of sort of French Mediterranean culture. I gather that they both had a vision of a cultural life around the circuit of the Mediterranean, where people of different backgrounds could come together in appreciation. And I thought this was just really tantalizing, and she alluded to it well, but I'd like to know more about it.
Yeah, I don't know much about Giono, but Camus himself was Algerian. He was born in Algeria, and I don't think he wanted Algerian independence. He was actually against it, and he and Sartre had a little they had a little tiff about it, because I think Sartre wanted Algerian independence. So I think he wanted to keep Algeria French in many ways. So there was an issue because he was born in Algeria. I mean, his famous novel is, of course, The Stranger, which is set in Algiers, right? It's about where he talks about, which is controversial. It's about the killing of an Arab on the beach, and then the subsequent trial. He was killed by a Frenchman, and then the subsequent trial. And that's an interesting novel. And I think it's been, I don't know whether it shows because you don't hear much about the Arab who's killed, and you hear, or we don't have, and there are no reasons given as to why. He says it was just the sun came in his eyes and it happened. So it kind of it's an interesting book about that period in Algeria. But I think you're right. I mean, in terms of the rich culture of Algeria, as I said, yes, it had a lot of people from all over. You had a lot of Spanish people who settled in Algeria. You had French, you had the Spanish, you had Italians, you had a Jewish community there. So definitely very rich Mediterranean culture that was in Algeria. So, but I don't know about much about Giono to talk with any kind of authority on Jean Giono's literature. So that would be something to kind of delve into. I think he's a Southern writer, though. He's from the South. And so there's definitely a Southern Mediterranean sensibility to his writing.
And he influenced Camus too, right?
Right. So yeah, so Camus is interesting, and there's been a book written. There's another book that came out recently, which was written by an Algerian writer, where the main character is the Arab who's killed in The Stranger.
L'Arabe.
Right. And I forget the name of the novel. What's it called?
I think, isn't it called The Arab?
No, I don't think so. I think it's called something else. I have it somewhere, but that's more recent. And so he's finally giving voice to the character who has no identity in the Camus novel. So it's told from his point of view, just to kind of show that, that Camus didn't give us his view. It was only the view of the main character who did the killing, who was a Frenchman. So it's interesting tension also between the two cultures, right? The French colonial culture, and of course, Camus is a product of the French colonial culture, right? He was a Pied Noir. His family was a Pied Noir.
For me, an interesting thing was, as an American reader, I knew very few of the French writers who were alluded to, and there are many. And I was wondering, for the French readership, who this book was kind of aimed at. It seemed a more intellectual audience, perhaps, and how would these authors and the history of all that publication have been familiar to the readership?
Some of the people that she mentions, I mean, I think she did an enormous amount of, the Kaouther Adimi, the author, did an enormous amount of research about that period, because she's obviously picking on, she talks about the review called L'Arche. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but he had also started a journal in Paris called L'Arche. He mentioned some very famous writers. André Gide is someone who's probably really well known in French culture. You have André Gide. She talks about she talks about Saint-Exupéry, because there is a scene and there is a moment in the journal where you hear about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, of the Petit Prince, of the Little Prince, who disappears. Remember, we never disappears while he's on a flight. He's a pilot, and we never hear about him. So a few authors, she mentions Sartre, there's a mention of Godin, there's a mention of Simone de Beauvoir. So yes, I think some of the writers are pretty well known, and most French people would be familiar with those writers. And the journal, she talks about La Nouvelle Revue Française, which was a very important journal at the time. And then Drieux La Rochelle, I mean, all those people. And then Gaston Gallimard, she talks about the beginning of Gallimard, which takes over his maison d'édition, right? So all this is, I mean, it is very important historically to talk about the history of publishing in a way, right? She's also giving you a little bit of history of the publishing world at the time, but also some of the writers. I don't think all the writers would be familiar. I mean, I don't remember reading anything by Jean Amrouche, for example, but many of the other authors are well known. Would be well known by a French audience, I think. So that would be an interesting question to ask her tomorrow when she's going to be interviewed by, yes, Renee.
The other thing, I was reading some quotes, just doing some research on the book. Apparently Charlot has been compared to, what's her name? Sylvia Beach, who basically started, I guess, Shakespeare and Company in Paris, and was lived in Paris and was very, I guess, responsible for, literature. I think she started, or at least published, Ulysses. If I'm not mistaken. So it's an interesting comparison. I mean, she was an American in Paris, and then they both had very similar missions.
The Shakespeare and Company is still there, I think, right? It
still is alive. Apparently, and well, the mob scene, the pandemic is over. You can't even get in. I mean, people are lined up.
Right. Yeah, it also says there's also a certain nostalgia for bookstores, right? Independent bookstores, which you don't see that much of anymore. This notion of browsing in an independent bookstore, which is kind of, still something that we don't see. I mean, a few towns still have independent. I think Rye has one. I mean, my neighborhood, Rye has one, and Greenwich still has one, and there are few stores that still exist, but this notion of just being able to kind of go in and read and browse through books is definitely very much part of the novel also. This love for literature, the love for books. And now everyone's reading. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I think it's coming back. I think that we all thought that our independent bookstores were going away. And I think that this speaks to the fact that we miss them, and that those years of browsing and luxuriating in stacks of books is not gone.
I thought some of that love of literature and the importance of literature came through in a really, for me, a pretty moving way. The trials and tribulations of getting the paper and the ink and making ink. That to me felt like a major part of the novel. I could visualize it.
Yeah. One of the things, what did you think about the structure of the novel, this idea of all the multiple voices? Was that disconcerting, or did it take you a while to get the hang of it? And what do you think that adds to the novel in terms of the, the first person narrative? You have Charlot, and then Riyad is also first person. Then you have the omniscient narrator who's commenting on them. And then you have the we of the people, of the Algerian people. It is a complicated structure, but in some ways you do get the hang of it, right? I mean, as you start reading it.
Yes. I was really impressed by the skill of the author, because I was never confused about the time I was in and who was speaking. I never once had to think, now, wait a minute, who is this person? Or are we in the past or are we in the present? I think that takes a lot. And
Yeah, I mean,
it's such a fashionable thing to do in fiction now.
mhm.
And so many people don't do it that well. And she got that prize from the teenagers, right?
Right.
Didn't she win a Goncourt des lycéens?
I think so.
I mean, that's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, the
It-
book
it
I have,
really-
I mean, I have this edition of the book, which was the Say edition. I think the one that the picture we saw was a different one. And I got this from Canada. And it was a finalist for the Prix Libraire in Quebec also.
Wow.
So that's what the little label says here. So I think the
Uh-huh.
Canadians gave it a prize too.
I think
So-
it eliminates the concept of unreliable narrator, since everything is viewed from several perspectives rather than just one person,
Correct.
which could be flawed.
Yes.
You know.
Right. Yeah, that's very, as I said, postmodern, right? To have multiplicity of voices. So you see different perspectives. Good point. Thank you, Farishta. Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted to,
Claire had something to
yes,
add. Yes.
I wanted to agree with Margie. I get very frustrated when I start a book and all of a sudden I have 29 characters to keep track of. And I think her style, it was such a nice writing style, because one of the obvious instruments she used, Charlot, was doing a journal. And so we automatically knew kind of the period he was talking about. And I was a little, of course, confused first couple pages when Riyadh was introduced, like what's going on here in Algeria. But it really was, it's like the skill of an author. And I was never a student of literature. So I don't identify these techniques that an author uses that bring you the story and present these views so subtly and so powerfully. But she did a nice job. I was highlighting all sorts of stuff in my book. This beautiful, her prose was just wonderful. It really appealed to me. So.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, the way she does it. I mean, obviously it took a lot of, to structure it in a certain way, you have to be very meticulous about, but the dates were very helpful. I think the way she used the dates and places, I think really kind of got you into that a little bit.
Binita, could you say more about Abdullah and how you see him and its importance?
Yeah, Abdullah, there's a lot to say about him, because I see him more as this bridge, as I said, between the past and the present. And he's almost like I think Renee pointed, as a mystical kind of ghostly figure going around in his white thing. And, he's there. I think he's trying to influence Riyadh in a way. He's trying to kind of say, there is a past here that we need to kind of treasure. Right. And I think that's the influence he's trying to have over this young man as the older character. But I need to think about him some more. I mean, I know I didn't spend too much time on him, but that's how I see him. I see him as this kind of ghostly kind of historical figure that kind of connects. He's trying to connect Riyadh with this. Now, my notion of Riyadh is that he's an Algerian who's born in Paris, right? So he's like first generation or second generation Algerian who's very not familiar with Algeria. And so this may have been his first trip or his second trip to Algeria, or to Algiers, right? To the capital. And so you have someone who's trying to also, who's French, right? Born in France, who's trying to also rediscover his own history, his own family history, his own roots, right? In a way. And so I see Abdullah as being this kind of character who's trying to kind of play that kind of father figure to him, or a grandfatherly figure to him, But it would be interesting to read just his sections again and to try and figure out, say, a little more about Abdullah, just to read. But right.
I have a quote, page 12.
Go ahead.
Avant, nous pouvions apercevoir Abdallah à travers la vitrine éclatante de propriétés s'affirmant, se battant contre des fourmis rouges. Parfois, des adolescents du quartier attendaient qu'il ait le dos tourné pour lui chaparder des livres, mettant le bazar dans son rangement. et laisser faire, déclarant à Moussa en haussant les épaules, bah, si ça le permet de lire, ses gamins. Son ami savait... Okay.
Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, son ami savait que les gens revendaient les livres sur un marché au alentour, mais n'osait pas en parler à Abdallah. So,
I think I have a different edition from yours, so I couldn't find that paragraph. But why did you pick that paragraph? Do you want to say a little bit about it? Yes.
I was on Kindle. So.
You were on Kindle.
Well, what I highlighted it because right before that, you know, he when he took out Abdullah had a cane, and they talked more about him it being his how he was dressed, you know, etc. But this new, you talked about the new. Before, we could see Abdallah crossing the window and fighting against the red mice. They for me.
Ants?
What ants? Ants,
Not
right?
the
Red
ants.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So it was like a nice expression of how this, you know, it's like a beaten down area. But he's still hanging around, and he's like, it's almost like even though it's declined, he's still kind of like you were saying, the ghost. He's haunting it to protect the memory because he appreciates the history. Where now the young people, and this is Abdallah, and it has nothing to do with Riyadh. Riyadh is kind of like my current perception. The young people don't appreciate a history of a neighborhood. The neighborhood I grew up in 60 years ago, the young people wouldn't appreciate that or any of the culture from that age. But this is the guy who's kind of trying to preserve it. That was like and his friend knew that these young were reselling their books at a market around, but would not dare to talk to Abdallah about it, you know. But
also there's also the little bit of a history of Abdallah, that he says that he was born when his father was working as a worker in dans une usine du Nord. So his father was probably in France in the
Lille.
And very early on, working as, you know, as a laborer, and left his family behind. You know, so they talk about him also being that. And so now, you know, Divina Sagan, okay. And also his, you know, there's a little biography of him, a little information about him on page, in my edition 18 and 19, where they talk about that. And then we know he's lost his wife, and he has a daughter who's married in Kabylie. She's in Kabylie.
I've just caught up with him. He was working as a worker in the Usines of the North.
Right, his father,
right before that one, but that one kind of touched me more. Oh, his wife was dead. See, I forget all these little details.
Yeah,
he had 3 or 4 months ago, but the book touched me. I really.
No, but they're haunting. He's a haunting character in a way, right?
Yes.
In more ways than one.
Yes.
Because he's, and he knows, and the neighborhood itself is very interesting around that. Hamini, the ex du Shahas. Obviously, the names have been changed after independence, right? So they made them more Algerian. But the neighborhood still has some of these old people who still remember the bookstore, right?
Right. And then there was one a little bit further at the end. Basically, voilà tout ce que nous savons sur cet homme. You know, il est resté sans se plaindre ni rien dire à personne. You know, voilà, that's all. But yeah, he was an interesting character in the neighborhood.
For anybody who has this edition on page 102 at the end of what's referred to as chapter 4, there's a very interesting sort of it's Abdallah talking about why the bookstore is named what it's named. Which basically
the Giono novel.
Yes, no, but it's something that he has memorized from the Giono book. I don't know if you have this, but I could just, I have it in French and in English, but it's kind of long. But they were used to waiting for orders and being told how to live. Now they decided to live as they pleased, simply not listening to anyone, and everything was lit up truly as when we find the match in the lamp and the house is illuminated and we know at last where to reach for what we need, etc. So it's very reflective of what's happening with the Algerian people. But it's at the end for those people that have it's right before the Sétif massacre, but it's quite a long passage.
I see it. Okay.
It's very.
That's right. I see it. I've underlined it. I noticed.
Yeah.
Durant la colonisation, il n'y avait qu'une école pour les Français, aucune pour nous. On m'a appris l'arabe et la zaoua et le français. Ça n'est arrivé qu'après l'indépendance, grâce à ma femme. And then later on, celui-ci, je les souviens, il s'agit des vraies richesses de Monsieur Giono.
No, but this is a different one. It starts with celui-ci que j'ai souvent lu. Il s'agit des vraies richesses de Monsieur Giono. J'avais envie de comprendre pourquoi cette librairie s'appelait ainsi.
I see that.
Yeah.
Pourquoi cette librairie?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's something in italics, right? That's the paragraph.
Exactly,
I have it in italics, right?
Yeah.
Since we are talking excerpts, because a lot of this book is about memories also.
Right.
So at the bottom of page 159, the last paragraph, I read it. Lorsque bien des années plus tard, nos grands-parents nous verront quitter le pays pour l'autre rive, ils nous diront de faire attention. Les Français sont durs et nous ne comprendrons pas car nous aurons oublié.
So true.
Are there other passages that people found interesting that they would like to read? Share. He also gives a nice picture of France during the occupation, which I thought was interesting, a nice portrait because he was in, there's that section too. Mentions of France during that period.
I highlighted something from my page 79. It's around your page 79 too. And what I said in English about it, this passage about Saint-Exupéry is wonderful. La rumeur qui court depuis plusieurs jours n'en est plus une. Saint-Exupéry a bien disparu en plein vol. L'un de mes plus beaux souvenirs de lui, nous étions invités à déjeuner chez un ami commun. À mon arrivée, tout le monde était là, sauf Antoine. Nous l'avons longuement attendu et inquiète. J'ai fini par regarder par la fenêtre. Il était assis sur le trottoir, sous un soleil aveuglant, entouré d'une nuée d'enfants qui semblaient heureux de joie. Il fabriquait pour eux des petits avions dans un papier argenté qui provenait des barres de chocolat fournies par l'armée. Il en avait toujours sur lui et les offrait aux gamins qu'il rencontrait dans la rue. Les petits avions montaient en tourbillonnant dans le ciel et les enfants, le visage babouillé, des traces du chocolat couraient, tentant de les suivre, sautant pour les attraper. Adieu, Antoine. So c'est so touchant.
Somebody mentioned that he was also, Charlot himself was not, he says there's a line, I just saw it underlined, l'écrivain doit écrire, l'éditeur doit donner vie au livre. Je ne vois pas de limite à cette conception. La littérature est trop importante pour ne pas y consacrer tout mon temps. Right? So he doesn't see himself. He's like, he gives birth to, I mean, he doesn't write himself, but he sees his role as kind of almost like giving birth to literature, giving birth to books that are, as an editor, right?
Right.
Donner vie, right? He says, donner vie au livre.
It makes a sense, the authors, if they didn't write the books, you can't everybody get a handwritten copy. He was important to spread all this beautiful literature. So we all have our part.
Okay.
If not a genius, maybe a good businessman. Oh, wasn't that kind of moving though to hear his angst? Because the one thing that really m'a frappé was during the war, getting supplies. We went through the pandemic and our supply chain. Oh my gosh. You know, all the stuff we went without because we couldn't get the stuff we were used to. But here's this author trying to publish books, and he had to worry about where to get the paper, where to get the ink, you know, so he was quite a trooper.
No, shortages during the war and during the occupation were very well documented, right? Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. It's a very rich novel in so many ways. One can keep talking about it, and there's things to discover and lines to, and passages that one can read and talk about. But
Benita, I think we're running out of time.
Running out of time. All right. Anyone? Thank you. Merci à tout le monde. Oui, merci à toutes.
And let's just remind everyone that tomorrow night, if you go to www.afusa.org to sign up and hear the author speak tomorrow night at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So that should be very, very exciting. She'll be interviewed by Amzad Jimli and Barbara Bougueño of Boston. But thank you so much, Benita.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your contributions. I appreciate it. Nice. It was great. Thank you.
Well done.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.